The classroom buzzed with the noise of restless students. Some tapped their pencils, others whispered and giggled, waiting for the lesson to begin. At the front of the room stood Ms. Thornton, the teacher. She was sharp-tongued and proud, the kind of person who enjoyed being in control. She often found small ways to remind everyone that she was above them. Whether through her strict rules or her cold remarks, that day her eyes fell on Mrs. Harris. The janitor, Mrs. Harris, had entered quietly with her mop and bucket, ready to finish her work before the students left for lunch. She always moved with quiet dignity, her uniform neat but simple, her hands calloused from years of hard work. Most students barely noticed her, except when someone made a mess. To them, she was just the janitor. Nothing more. But Ms. Thornton noticed her differently. For reasons no one understood, the teacher often treated Mrs. Harris with a certain edge, as if she enjoyed reminding her of her place. When the students grew rowdy that morning, Ms. Thornton smirked and looked toward the piano in the corner of the room. Then her gaze shifted to Mrs. Harris. "You there?" she said sharply, pointing at her. "Come here for a moment." The janitor paused, startled. She wasn't used to being spoken to during class. Slowly, she set aside her mop and walked forward, all eyes turning to her. The students whispered, some curious, others grinning, waiting for entertainment. Ms. Thornton gestured at the piano. "Why don't you play something for us?" she said, her tone dripping with mockery. The class erupted in laughter. A few clapped their hands in fake excitement. "Yeah, let her play." Someone shouted from the back. Mrs. Harris froze. She looked at the piano, then back at the teacher, confusion flickering across her face. I don't play," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the laughter. But Ms. Thornton wasn't satisfied. She leaned against her desk, smirking as if this was all a game. "Oh, I think you can. Surely you know how to press a few keys. Or are you afraid?" The laughter grew louder, sharper. Students nudged each other, enjoying the spectacle. To them, it was just another joke at the expense of someone they thought unimportant. They expected her to stumble, to fumble at the keys, to prove she was nothing more than a janitor. Mrs. Harris's cheeks flushed, but she remained calm. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, judging, mocking, expecting her to fail. Inside, her heart ached not because she couldn't play, but because of the cruelty in their laughter. They didn't know her story. They didn't know the hands that held the mop once knew something far different. She stepped closer to the piano. Her steps slow, hesitant. The laughter followed her like a shadow, echoing in her ears. Ms. Thornton crossed her arms, certain she had won this cruel game. The janitor stood before the piano, her hand hovering over the polished wood. For a moment, she didn't move. She only stared at the keys, her reflection faintly visible in their smooth black and white surface. Memories stirred, memories she had buried long ago, memories of her as a young woman. Seated at another piano, playing for small crowds, her fingers alive with music. Life had taken that away, replacing her dreams with responsibility, with hard work. With survival, the students didn't know any of this. To them, the silence was just awkward, funny even. One boy coughed loudly and another whispered, "She probably doesn't even know where middle C is." The laughter returned in small bursts. Mrs. Harris closed her eyes for a brief second. She could have walked away. She could have refused. But something inside her stirred something stronger than pride. Something that had been silent for too long. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the piano bench. The laughter softened into a hush. Even the students didn't expect her to actually sit. They leaned forward, curious now. Ms. Thornton raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "Well then," the teacher said, her voice loud and mocking. "Show us what you've got." Mrs. Harris rested her fingers gently on the keys. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She could feel the ghosts of old melodies waiting to return. The room buzzed with expectation, everyone waiting for her to embarrass herself. But Mrs. Harris didn't rush. She sat tall, her back straight, her eyes calm. She let the silence stretch longer than anyone expected. It was a silence heavy enough to quiet even the whispers in the back of the room. For the first time that day, the students weren't laughing. They were waiting, and though no one knew it yet, that cruel challenge, the attempt to ridicule her, was about to become the moment that changed everything. The moment Mrs. Harris sat on the piano bench, the room seemed to change. At first, there was silence, but it didn't last. A ripple of laughter broke out across the classroom, sharp and cruel, the kind that digs into the heart. Students elbowed each other, covering their mouths to hide grins, while others whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "She doesn't even know what she's doing," one boy snickered. "She probably thinks the black keys make one song and the white keys make another," another added. And the group around him burst out laughing. Mrs. Harris kept her eyes on the piano, her hands hovering uncertainly above the keys. She didn't look at them. She didn't respond. But she could hear every cruel word, every giggle, every snort of mockery. It was not the first time she had been laughed at. Her whole life she had endured this sound. In the store, when she could not afford new clothes. In the neighborhood, when people looked down on her job. In her youth, when she dared to dream bigger than others thought she should. The laughter was familiar, but still it stung. Ms. Thornton stood at the front of the room, arms folded, lips curved into a smirk. The teacher's satisfaction was clear. This was what she wanted, for the students to see Mrs. Harris humiliated, to remind her of her place. Every chuckle was like a small victory to Ms. Thornton, who believed the janitor belonged behind a mop, not in front of a piano. The laughter grew louder. Some students even began mimicking piano playing in the air, moving their fingers wildly as though mocking what they thought Mrs. Harris was about to do. A few tapped the desks like drums, chanting, "Play, play, play," in a cruel rhythm. The room became a circus, the janitor the unwilling performer. For a brief second, Mrs. Harris's hands trembled. She thought of standing up, walking away, ending this cruel game. She could leave, let them think she was too afraid, too unskilled. It would be easier. But as she sat there, she remembered something deep within herself, an echo of her younger days. A stage, a spotlight, fingers dancing across ivory keys, pulling music out of silence. She remembered applause, not laughter. She remembered joy, not shame. Her jaw tightened. She would not walk away. Still, the laughter pressed in on her like a wall. Even the students who didn't join in, the quieter ones, watched with curiosity, waiting for her to fail. That silence was almost worse than the noise. They weren't laughing, but they weren't stopping it, either. They were waiting for a show, and they expected it to be a failure. Any day now. Ms. Thornton said loudly, her tone sharp with sarcasm. "We're all waiting." The students chuckled again. One boy muttered, "This is going to be hilarious." Mrs. Harris finally placed her hands on the keys. The cool touch of the piano sent a shiver through her. It had been years since she last played, years of dust, of silence, of work that left her too tired to dream. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the keys. The laughter quieted a little, curiosity mixing with the cruelty. They leaned forward, eager to see her stumble. A girl whispered, "She's really going to try," and her friend smirked. This is going to be good. But something was changing, though they didn't see it yet. Mrs. Harris's shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed, and her trembling hands steadied. To the students, it looked like nothing. But inside, it was everything. It was the moment she decided she would not let their laughter define her. She pressed a single key. A soft note filled the room, fragile yet clear. Some students giggled again, covering their mouths, expecting a clumsy noise to follow. Instead, Mrs. Harris closed her eyes, her fingers resting gently in place. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She let the sound linger in the air. The laughter began to fade, not because they respected her, but because they were confused. It wasn't what they expected. Something in her calmness unsettled them. She opened her eyes again and looked at the piano, as if it was an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Her hands moved slowly, almost cautiously, and the next notes fell into place. The laughter weakened more. Students tilted their heads, their mocking smiles faltering, though they didn't yet know why. For now, the room was still filled with whispers and chuckles, but under it all, a shift was beginning. The cruel laughter that had surrounded her was about to die, replaced by something none of them could have imagined. And Mrs. Harris knew it. She could feel it. The laughter was loud, but her music would be louder. The piano sat like a silent witness, waiting for her decision. Mrs. Harris's fingers rested lightly on the keys, trembling only for a moment before becoming still. The laughter around her had faded into uncertain whispers, but the weight of their mocking still hung in the air. Every eye was locked on her. Every breath in the room seemed to hold back, expecting her to fail. She closed her eyes. For a second, the classroom disappeared. The whispers, the giggles, even Ms. Thornton's smug expression, all of it slipped away. In her mind, she was not in a classroom surrounded by children who doubted her. She was back in her youth, sitting in a small church hall. Her parents in the front row, listening as she played for the very first time. She remembered the smell of polished wood, the glow of sunlight on the old piano, the sound of applause that made her heart soar. Her lips pressed together, and she took a steady breath. Then, without warning, her fingers pressed down. The first few notes spilled into the room. Soft, hesitant, like a whisper testing its strength. The students snickered again, nudging each other as if to say, "See? We were right." But then something shifted. The hesitation melted, and her hands began to move more smoothly. The notes connected, one to another, weaving a fragile melody that hovered in the air. It was not clumsy. It was not forced. It was gentle yet filled with something raw, something alive. The laughter weakened. A few students leaned forward in their seats, their smirks faltering. The sound was not what they expected. It wasn't noise. It wasn't random pressing of keys. It was music, real music, delicate but steady, each note touching something deep inside them. Mrs. Harris opened her eyes. They no longer held fear or hesitation. They were calm, steady, almost glowing. Her fingers moved with new confidence, as though the piano had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for years. The longer she played, the straighter she sat, her back tall, her face serene. Ms. Thornton's smirk began to fade. She had expected a disaster, a joke that would make her students laugh louder and longer. But instead, she felt something strange in the pit of her stomach. It was the realization that this woman, the janitor she had mocked for years, was not stumbling, she was shining. The melody grew richer. It wasn't fast or dramatic yet, but it was filled with feeling. Each note seemed to carry a story, a memory, a quiet pain mixed with beauty. The students stopped giggling. The rhythm of the music made them uneasy, made them curious. Some shifted in their chairs, their expressions softening as the sound pulled them in. Mrs. Harris's fingers no longer trembled. They moved with a natural grace, finding their way across the keys as if guided by memory alone. It had been years since she had last played seriously. But talent like hers never truly disappears. It waits, hidden until the moment it is needed most. The room grew quieter. Only the piano spoke now, its voice filling every corner, wrapping around the students like a thread they couldn't escape. Even the ones who had laughed the loudest fell silent, their eyes fixed on her hands. She was not playing to impress them. She was not playing to prove anything to Ms. Thornton. She was playing because it was who she was. The music had always lived inside her, buried under years of mopping floors, scrubbing desks, and being overlooked. But now, in this strange moment born of cruelty, that music had found its way back. The notes lifted higher, brighter as her confidence grew. For a second, it felt as though the classroom was gone. Instead, it was a concert hall, the air heavy with silence, the audience waiting for every next sound. Her face softened, her eyes distant, lost in the music. And for the first time, the students felt something they didn't expect. It wasn't just surprise, which was respect. They were beginning to see her differently, though none of them would admit it yet, as the last note of her short phrase hung in the air. No one laughed. No one clapped either. They simply sat there, stunned, waiting. Mrs. Harris let her hands hover for a moment, then slowly rested them in her lap. The silence that followed was not like the silence before. This one was heavier, deeper, almost reverent. Even Ms. Thornton, who had started the cruel challenge, found herself caught in it, her face stiff as she struggled to hold on to her authority. Mrs. Harris looked up at the class, her expression calm, her dignity unbroken. She had only just begun, but already the balance had shifted. The students no longer saw her as just a janitor. They saw someone who carried something extraordinary inside her, something that mocked their laughter without saying a single word. And deep down, every person in that room felt it. The first touch of her keys had changed everything. The room sat in uneasy silence, the echoes of her first notes still hanging in the air. Mrs. Harris kept her hands on the piano, her fingertips brushing lightly against the keys as though she were touching something fragile, something sacred. The students stared, unsure of what they had just witnessed. A janitor, the woman they had seen sweeping floors and emptying trash cans, had just played a line of music that sounded real. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't clumsy. It was alive. She drew in a slow breath. Memories stirred. She hadn't wanted them, hadn't expected them, but the music had unlocked a door inside her that she had kept shut for many years. Behind that door was the young girl she used to be, sitting at a piano not very different from this one, her father's hand resting proudly on her shoulder, her mother humming softly in the background. The laughter in the room faded completely as she pressed down again. This time, there was no hesitation. The melody that poured out was not a random tune, it was something older, something buried deep in her heart. A song she had learned as a child, a song she had once played for competitions and gatherings. Her fingers moved with grace, remembering each note as if no time had passed. The music grew fuller. It wasn't just sound, it was a story. The notes climbed gently, rising and falling like waves, carrying emotions too heavy for words. Students who had been smirking minutes earlier now leaned forward, their eyes wide. The sound tugged at them, stirring feelings they didn't know how to name. Some felt warmth, others a sharp sting in their chest, as if the music was pulling at hidden memories of their own. Mrs. Harris's face softened as she played, her eyes half closed, her body swaying gently with the rhythm. She was no longer in that classroom. She was somewhere else entirely, back in time, back when dreams still felt possible, when the piano was her closest friend. Each note carried a piece of her past. Each chord whispered secrets of the life she had almost lived. Ms. Thornton's smirk was gone. She stood stiff at the front of the room, her arms uncrossed now, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had wanted humiliation, but instead she felt something she hadn't expected: shame. The janitor she had mocked was filling the room with music more beautiful than anything she herself could have produced. The students exchanged glances, But no one dared to laugh now. The music demanded silence. It wrapped around them, drawing them in whether they wanted it or not. Even the rowdy boy in the back, who always had a joke ready, sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. The song deepened, swelling with emotion. It was no longer gentle, it carried weight, sorrow, and power. Mrs. Harris remembered long nights when she had dreamed of becoming a pianist, of traveling and performing, of making her parents proud. She remembered the moment those dreams ended, when her family struggles forced her to give up the piano and take on jobs that paid bills instead of applause. Every note she played now carried that story, a mix of joy and pain, loss and dignity. The classroom, once filled with noise and laughter, felt like a concert hall. The students forgot they were supposed to be mocking her. They forgot the teacher's cruel challenge. They were simply listening, caught in the spell of her music. One girl in the front row blinked quickly, surprised to feel tears in her eyes. A boy clenched his jaw, feeling a lump in his throat. They didn't understand why. But the music touched something raw inside them, something that had nothing to do with Mrs. Harris being a janitor, and everything to do with the power of her song. She moved into the final part of the melody, her fingers dancing faster now, each note brighter, stronger, defiant. It was as if she was telling them, "I am more than what you see. I am more than what you think I am." And then, with a slow, graceful finish, she let the last note linger in the air. It rang clear and true, echoing into silence. She lifted her hands gently from the keys, resting them in her lap, her breathing calm. The classroom was utterly still. Not a giggle, not a whisper, not even the scrape of a chair broke the silence. The same students who had laughed minutes ago now sat stunned, their eyes fixed on her. Mrs. Harris opened her eyes and looked at them, her face calm but her dignity shining brighter than ever. She hadn't played to prove herself. She had played because the music demanded to be heard. And in that moment, every person in the room understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. What had begun as ridicule had turned into revelation. The final note of her melody hovered in the air, soft but sharp, like a whisper that refused to fade. Mrs. Harris's hands rested quietly on her lap, her fingers still tingling with the memory of the keys. For a moment, there was nothing. No laughter, no whispering, no sound at all. The classroom was frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. It was strange just minutes earlier. The room had been alive with cruel jokes, giggles, and taunts. The students had been eager to watch her stumble, eager to laugh at her expense. But now, that same group sat motionless, their eyes wide, their mouths shut. The music had wrapped itself around them and stolen every sound from their throats. A single cough broke the silence in the back row, and even that sounded nervous, embarrassed, as if it didn't belong. No one dared to laugh anymore. They couldn't. Something in the way Mrs. Harris played, something in the truth that poured out of her music, had silenced them more completely than any teacher's shout ever could. Mrs. Harris lifted her head slowly, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even smile. Her face was calm, her dignity untouched. She had not played for their applause or their respect. She had played because the music inside her could no longer stay hidden. And that made her performance even more powerful. The students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some looked down at their desks, ashamed of the laughter that had escaped their lips earlier. Others stared at her, almost in awe, as though they were seeing her for the very first time. They had known her only as the woman who swept their halls, the one who wiped their desks and emptied their trash cans. But in those few minutes, she had transformed into someone else entirely, an artist, a storyteller, a woman whose music carried a weight none of them could ignore. Even Ms. Thornton, who had orchestrated the humiliation, stood rigid and pale at the front of the room, Her smug smile had vanished. She had expected to watch the janitor stumble, to hear clumsy notes that would spark another round of laughter. Instead, she had been silenced too. The music had struck her deeper than she wanted to admit. Her pride wouldn't let her show it, but she knew the truth: she had been wrong. Terribly wrong. The silence stretched on. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. Each student was trapped in it, lost in their own thoughts, replaying what they had just heard. Some felt guilt prick at them, remembering how they had laughed just moments earlier. Others felt something softer, a strange respect growing in their hearts. One boy in the back whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "That was amazing." His words broke the spell, but not the silence. Instead of laughter, there was only agreement in the quiet nods of the students around him. Mrs. Harris finally stood, her hands brushing lightly against her uniform. She did not bow, did not wait for applause. She simply rose with the same quiet grace she had carried when she entered. Her eyes swept the room once more, calm and steady, and then she stepped away from the piano. Still, no one spoke. The silence followed her as she walked back toward her mop and bucket. As if even the sound of her footsteps was too loud for the moment. The students weren't used to this kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of boredom or waiting for the bell. It wasn't the silence of fear after being scolded by a teacher. This silence was different. It was respect, shock, and reflection all at once. It was a silence that comes after something unforgettable. When words feel too small to describe what was just experienced, Ms. Thornton finally cleared her throat, trying to regain control. But her voice cracked slightly as she said, "All right, let's move on." The words felt weak, meaningless. She knew it, and so did the students. Nothing could move on after what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Harris didn't look back as she returned to her work. She lifted her mop, dipping it into the bucket, resuming her duty as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the extraordinary lingered in every corner of the room. The students could not see her as just a janitor anymore. For the rest of the class, hardly anyone spoke. Pencils scratched against paper, but the usual chatter was gone. Every student was still hearing the echoes of the song in their minds. Some couldn't stop thinking about how much emotion had filled each note. Others wondered what kind of life Mrs. Harris had lived. What stories had shaped the music they had just heard. The silence became the loudest lesson of the day, and deep down, every student knew they would carry that moment with them forever. The day laughter turned into silence, and silence turned into respect. The silence that had filled the classroom lingered long after Mrs. Harris returned to her work. Students sat quietly, but their thoughts buzzed louder than ever. They had just heard something extraordinary. Something that didn't fit the picture they had always held of the woman who mopped their floors. The janitor they had overlooked was not ordinary. She had carried something inside her, something powerful, something hidden by the time the bell rang. Whispers had already started. As students filed out into the hall, their voices carried fragments of questions. How did she play like that? Do you think she used to be a musician? I've never heard anything like it. Some said she must have learned in secret. Others believed she had once performed, maybe even on a real stage. A few doubted it still, trying to convince themselves that what they heard wasn't as good as it seemed. But deep down, none of them could shake the truth. Her music was real, and it had touched them in ways they couldn't explain. Later that day, one of the older teachers stopped in the teacher's lounge. She had been at the school for decades, longer than most of the staff. When the students mentioned the piano, her eyes lit up with recognition. "You didn't know," she said softly. Mrs. Harris was once a prodigy. She studied piano in her youth. She was meant for bigger things. The students overheard. The story spread like wildfire. Mrs. Harris had not always been a janitor. Long ago, she had been a rising star. She had trained under respected teachers, entered competitions, even dreamed of performing professionally. But life, as it often does, had intervened. Her parents had fallen ill, and she had been forced to leave behind her dreams to care for her family. One sacrifice led to another until music became a memory, replaced by work that paid the bills but did not feed the soul. The more the story spread, the more respect grew in the hearts of those who had mocked her. Some students felt guilty tears sting their eyes when they thought of how they had laughed at her uniform, her job, her quiet presence in the halls. How could they have been so blind? The woman they had dismissed as just a janitor had once carried more talent in her fingertips than most of them would ever hold in their entire lives. At lunch, the whispers continued. She could have been famous. She gave it all up for her family. That explains everything why she played like that, why it felt so. Deep, even the bullies who had joined in Miss Thornton's cruel game sat quietly, their food untouched. The memory of the song weighed heavily on them. They had laughed at her, mocked her, treated her as less than human, and now they realized they had been mocking someone who had already given up so much. Someone who deserved admiration, not ridicule. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harris went on with her day as if nothing had changed. She swept, mopped, emptied bins, and greeted the few students who dared to look her in the eye. She didn't seek attention, didn't try to explain herself, didn't confirm or deny the rumors swirling through the school. For her, the piano was not a stage for pride, was simply part of who she was. But the students could not let it go. They watched her differently now. The same hands that wiped desks had once glided across piano keys with brilliance. The same woman they ignored had once carried dreams larger than the walls of the school itself. Even Ms. Thornton could not escape the whispers. She overheard the story too, and her face tightened with shame. The lesson she had tried to teach, the lesson of humiliation, had turned into something else entirely. She had exposed herself. Not Mrs. Harris. She had revealed her own arrogance, her own cruelty. While the janitor she mocked stood taller without saying a word. That night, as the students went home, many told their parents about what had happened. Some described the performance with awe. Others admitted their shame and laughing. Parents shook their heads in disbelief. Some even remembered hearing the name Harris long ago, back when she was young and talented, before life had forced her onto a different path. The hidden history was no longer hidden. The whispers had become a story, and the story had become a lesson. The janitor they thought they knew was not just a cleaner of halls. She was a woman of sacrifice, of strength, of talent buried but never lost. And as the truth spread, so did the silence of respect. The students didn't laugh at her anymore. They couldn't. Every time they saw her walk through the halls with her mop and bucket, they saw not weakness, but quiet greatness. They saw a woman who had carried her dreams, set them aside for love and duty, and still, after all those years, could sit at a piano and stun them all. The hidden history had been revealed, and it changed the way they looked at her forever. Ms. Thornton had always loved being in control. She loved the sound of her heels on the floor, the way students straightened when she entered, the way her sharp words could silence a room. For years, she believed respect came from fear. But after that day, when Mrs. Harris touched the piano and filled the classroom with music, Miss Thornton's sense of power began to crumble. At first, she tried to brush it off. She told herself it was nothing, that anyone could memorize a few songs, that the janitor had only gotten lucky. But the whispers around the school grew louder, and the story became impossible to ignore. Students no longer laughed at Mrs. Harris. They looked at her with awe. They no longer looked at Ms. Thornton the same way either. She tried to humiliate her, one student whispered in the hall. And instead, she humiliated herself, another replied. Those words burned Ms. Thornton more than she cared to admit. She overheard them when she passed groups of students. She noticed the way they glanced at her, not with fear or respect, but with quiet judgment. The smirk she wore so easily before felt heavy now, fake, brittle, in the teacher's lounge. She caught fragments of conversation between her colleagues. They spoke softly, but she knew who they were talking about. I had no idea Mrs. Harris could play like that. Such talent, and to think. A pause. To think she was treated like that in front of the children. Ms. Thornton's face burned. Her pride, once her strongest armor, now felt like a chain dragging her down. She had exposed not Mrs. Harris, but herself, her cruelty, her arrogance. Her inability to see the dignity in someone who worked quietly in the shadows. The shame followed her into the classroom. When she stood before her students now, she no longer held their attention. Their eyes wandered, some staring at the piano in the corner, others casting her looks that made her stomach twist. They knew what she had done. They had watched it unfold. No amount of authority could erase that memory. One afternoon, as she was gathering papers, a student raised a hand. "Miss," he asked carefully, "why did you make her play?" The question was innocent enough, but the tone carried something sharper accusation. Ms. Thornton's throat tightened. She forced a thin smile. "It was just a harmless moment," she said quickly. But the students didn't believe her. Their faces told her everything. They knew it hadn't been harmless. That night, Ms. Thornton sat at her desk, staring at her lesson plans. Her mind wasn't on the papers. It was on Mrs. Harris. She replayed the scene in her head again and again, the laughter. The mocking challenge, the janitor's hesitant hands on the keys. And then the music, strong and pure, silencing them all. She remembered the way Mrs. Harris had stood afterward, calm and dignified, while she herself stood frozen, her smirk gone. Her authority stripped bare. For the first time in years, Ms. Thornton felt small. She realized that respect built on fear is fragile. It can shatter in a single moment. And it had. The shame deepened when she saw Mrs. Harris again the next morning. The janitor moved quietly through the halls, pushing her cart, mop, and rags neatly arranged. She did not look at Ms. Thornton with anger. She did not avoid her either. She simply walked past with the same quiet grace she always carried, her head held high. That silence cut deeper than any harsh word could have. Ms. Thornton wanted to say something, an apology, a thank you, anything but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to admit aloud what everyone already knew, that she had been cruel. And Mrs. Harris had risen above her cruelty without a single insult in return. The more Ms. Thornton thought about it, the heavier her shame became. She realized that Mrs. Harris had not only stunned the students with her music, she had revealed the truth about dignity. True dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't fight to be seen. It simply exists, strong and unshakable. Even when mocked, the teacher had tried to ridicule the janitor, but instead she had ridiculed herself. The students saw it, the other teachers saw it, and worst of all, she saw it every time she looked in the mirror. From that day on, Ms. Thornton's voice lost its edge. She spoke softer, not because she wanted to, but because she no longer believed in her own superiority. Her shame had humbled her. She had wanted to make an example out of Mrs. Harris, but the example that day was herself. She had shown the students what arrogance looks like, and Mrs. Harris had shown them what true greatness looks like. And that lesson, she realized bitterly, would never be forgotten. Asterisk, the days that followed were not the same. Students no longer looked at Mrs. Harris with indifference. Every time she walked into a classroom to clean, the room grew quiet, not out of pity, but out of respect. The woman they had once ignored, or worse, laughed at, had shown them something unforgettable. Her music still echoed in their minds, long after the final note had faded. One afternoon, the principal announced a school assembly. The students gathered in the auditorium, restless at first, chatting and laughing as they waited for the program to begin. On the stage sat the same piano that had silenced the classroom days before. The sight of it sent a wave of whispers through the crowd. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone was hoping for the same thing when Mrs. Harris stepped onto the stage. Pushing back her mop and bucket for once, the room hushed instantly. She wore her uniform still, the same clothes she always worked in, but somehow it looked different now. To the students, it was no longer a symbol of low status, it was a badge of quiet strength. She walked to the piano. Her steps slow, steady, her eyes calm. She didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't ask for attention. She simply sat, placed her hands gently on the keys, and let the silence fill the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with the same grace as before, she began to play. This time, the melody was bigger, fuller, stronger. Her fingers danced across the keys with confidence, weaving notes that rose like fire and fell like rain. The sound filled every corner of the auditorium, wrapping itself around the students, the teachers, even the principal. It wasn't just music, it was a voice, a story, a truth too powerful to ignore. Some students closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others stared, their mouths slightly open, as if they couldn't believe this was the same woman they had walked past in the hallways for years without noticing. The music carried sorrow, but also hope. It spoke of dreams lost and dignity kept, of sacrifices made and strength that never broke. It was the sound of someone who had once been forced to give up her future, but had never lost her soul by the time she reached the climax. The entire room was breathless. The notes thundered, then softened, then rose again with a beauty so raw it made goosebumps crawl up arms. Teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, ashamed that they too had overlooked her for so long. Students felt their hearts ache, not from guilt alone, but from admiration, and then, just as before, she ended with a single lingering note, a sound that seemed to hang in the air long after her hands had lifted from the keys. For a moment, the silence returned. It was deep, heavy, and full of awe. And then applause. Not just polite clapping, but a roar of hands and voices rising together. Students jumped to their feet, clapping, shouting, cheering. The sound filled the auditorium with more force than the music itself. A standing ovation. Mrs. Harris did not smile widely. She did not cry. She simply sat quietly, her head bowed slightly, as if she were humbled by their response. But in her eyes, there was a glow of soft pride, not for herself, but for the music that had finally been heard. The principal stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. Today, we have all learned something important. We learned that greatness can hide in the places we least expect. We learned that respect is not earned by uniforms or titles, but by the strength of the human spirit. His words were true, but everyone already knew it. The lesson had been taught not by him, not by the teachers, but by the janitor who had played the piano. Ms. Thornton sat in the front row, her face pale. She clapped, but her applause was weak, her shame still heavy. She knew this ovation wasn't just for Mrs. Harris, was a reminder of her own cruelty. A reminder that she had tried to humiliate someone far greater than herself. The applause lasted long after. Mrs. Harris stood and quietly left the stage. Students leaned forward, still clapping, still cheering, until the sound filled the rafters and bounced off the walls. It wasn't just applause, it was an apology. It was respect. It was love. And as Mrs. Harris walked back down the aisle, mop and bucket waiting for her in the corner, she didn't need to say a word. She had given them her song, and they had given her something back: acknowledgement, dignity, and a place in their hearts that would never fade. The standing ovation was not just for the music. It was for her strength, for her story, for the truth that had stunned them all.